I'll often say, like, I'm not a guru. Like, I mess up all the time. You could talk to my kids, you could talk to my family, ex-partners, and they could tell you, like, yeah, Luke's got some challenges sometimes when it comes to communicating.
Yeah. So this month, the topic is communication, right?
Yeah.
So I thought we might talk about something around that in families. What you found kind of as maybe some barriers to communication.
Even when someone comes to therapy, like, that's a whole communication shift.
What do you mean?
Well, because typically what I find is that they don't talk about that stuff in a family.
The kind of stuff we talk about in therapy.
Therapy, right? Like this
That's true.
sort of working through that. So that's a huge shift, right? And then, getting through all the different barriers. There could be cultural barriers, there could be gender barriers, identity barriers. I'm not supposed to ask for help.
Right.
It could be
Trust.
all
Does
kinds of trust issues, right? Because
How long does it take you usually to get people to like feel comfortable enough in therapy to start speaking about the deeper things? I know that's a hard question because clients are all different, but in general, in your experience.
I don't know if it's so much me or if it's so much either maybe sometimes the topic or where they're at in the process of, I need to get through this. I need to figure this out. And I mean, I've had people who have been told to come and see me.
Right. So they referred, so it's safe.
Yeah. So, but also that have been forced to come and see me in some of the other positions I've been in.
Right.
And it's not so much forced, like I've been in situations where they've been forced by law to come and see you.
Yeah.
And that sometimes has worked out well. But also in the situations where they're in a situation where their partner or their family member says, you need to go see someone or this is done.
Mm-hmm. So it's like the last straw.
Right.
Yeah. The final like thing before it's going to be open. But isn't that don't you find it's too late if people come in at that point sometimes?
Well,
if they don't really want to be there and somebody's given them an ultimatum.
I would look at it could be too late maybe for that relationship. But it may not be too late for the individual actually coming to actually talk to you.
Mm.
And so you got to weigh that.
Right.
And that's a really hard one, right? Because losing, like sometimes we put a lot into relationships. Like everything we can think of is in those relationships.
Right.
And that's not always the healthiest thing.
Right.
Because you lose yourself. Right. And how do you communicate that? Right.
I've
lost myself.
Right.
I still care about you. I still, all of those things. I don't know who I am.
Right. Right.
And that's a huge shift for people. But it's really hard to talk about that.
Because we don't in regular life.
Right.
Right.
Well, I shouldn't say it's hard. It's a challenge. Because it's not a normal conversation that we have.
Sometimes people ask me that, right? Like, what's the difference between what you talk to your therapist about and say, like, coffee with a friend?
Right.
So what's been your experience of that?
As a friend, there's a dialogue where we're sharing things back and forth. Right?
Yeah.
And as a therapist, well, that can happen in therapy too, right? So,
but it's not really about you, right?
No,
as a therapist, it's like you're centering that other person, and it's about their story.
Yeah.
Whereas in a conversation with a friend, if it was always like that,
Yeah.
you probably wouldn't end up being friends with that person
Yeah.
for too long. If it was always just about them.
Yeah, and
Right?
I don't want people to think like you come and see a therapist and all therapists are like, so tell me how you feel.
Right.
It's not always like that, right? But there is that reflection, that certainly that back and forth, and there are moments in therapy where there is self-disclosure because it makes
people might not know what that means.
So where you actually use parts of yourself or parts of your experience to help sort of be in congruence, so be in flow
with the client.
Right? It doesn't mean that you're always taking out everything that you need to talk about.
Because it's not about you.
It's not about you, but there can be those moments. I remember when I used to do this group years ago with a colleague of mine. He's a great guy. And we used to do that in front of the group.
Mm-hmm.
Like we used to talk about, I'd talk about my diabetes and how I'd be just crushing my diet and doing great. And then I'd make the conscious choice to eat a whole chocolate cake. Like I would, and people will get that.
Right, because they've lived it too.
They've lived that, right? Yeah. Where they could be working on a relationship, communicating with somebody, and they feel like things are going really well. And you know, sometimes we'll self-sabotage that situation.
Right.
We're great at, doing that to ourselves.
So how do people take what they learn about communication from therapy
Right.
and like implement it? Because I get that question too from my clients. So like, it's great, I can talk to you about it
Yeah.
here, but this other person like doesn't have the training, doesn't have the mindset, it doesn't have the patience
Right.
or the capacity to regulate to actually hear what I'm saying. So how do you kind of coach people to communicate honestly and vulnerably in outside of therapy? Or do you just tell them to avoid that, or like how does
No.
never do this anywhere else? Don't be honest. Don't be real.
Don't
yourself.
be real with your person. I think one of the most challenging things is people have a hard time seeing that they come to see a therapist. That's a huge thing for a lot of people.
Mhm.
Or a counselor, or a coach, whatever they're calling us, or
Mhm.
whatever our training is in. And taking that and seeing that as being really authentic and vulnerable.
Just coming.
Right. And then actually applying that to their current situation. Right. It's like, well, so how did you get here? Well, I knew I had to, right? And
resourcing.
And you can feel that, right? You can feel I gotta talk to this person, right? And I'm breaking all kinds of barriers here.
Right.
Because there could be so much going on that they've dealt with.
Mhm.
Like so much history, different traumas.
And people have an impression of what therapy is going to be
Oh,
too,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's like, tell me, and they're like lying down on a couch, and
Yeah.
like that's not how it is.
No, I mean,
not for you and me anyway.
No, but I think people said, well, you don't look like a therapist. I'm like, oh, what's a therapist look like? Well, they have glasses, they sit there with a pipe, and it's like, what?
That's like 80 years ago.
Right?
Therapy.
And so, but it really shows what people bring with them, right?
Yeah, the kind of
this idea, and the same thing with communication, right? We all have an idea, like, we're in a relationship together, saying it's supposed to just go wonderful, and we're all supposed to know the right things to say and say it properly.
Mhm.
And when you talked about, how do I coach people or share, like, I'll often say, like, I'm not a guru. Like, I mess up all the time. You could talk to my kids, you could talk to my family, ex-partners, and they could tell you, like, yeah, Luke's got some challenges sometimes when it comes to communicating.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes it more understandable by people,
Mhm.
to know that, like, I don't have all the
like
answers.
we're people too.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Right?
With our own journeys
we
and
mess
flaws.
up all the
Oh
time.
my gosh. I like use my mess up stories all the time.
Right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard, right? Because some of those mess ups.
You're like, I just told my client this, or my client and I were just talking about this last week, and now I'm doing that thing that they're learning not to do, but I'm doing the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
100%.
Because we're people.
Do as I say, not as I do. No, I'm just kidding.
But I think there's something to be said about like that accountability. I think in the role that we're in, it's like we have to be doing our work, and because to just be like, oh, let me be here and be here for you, but then my life, I'm not going to look at that. I'm not going to be honest in my own life. I'm not going to communicate with like that's problematic.
Yeah.
Right. So there's that authenticity and like congruence, like you were saying, where we have to do our work to this standard. And we joke about that. It's like once you say, like, so I teach, right, at a university, and what we talk about how, if you're taking this on, like, you're also taking on a lifestyle, and a way of being in the world that's different than maybe, just anybody who doesn't necessarily have that mantle, because it feels heavy sometimes.
Well, there's two different things, like scenarios, right? Like, you want to be your authentic self and enjoy yourself and live your life and have your friends and go out and enjoy yourself. And sometimes you can go past that, right? And that's the learning, right? It's like, oh yeah, I signed up to be to this, and some people may not agree with that, and that's fine. I've shared with people, like, I can't just walk down the street, and if someone says something to me, I just can't lose my shit on them.
Right.
Because they won't see just some guy losing their shit.
Right.
If they know
it's
me.
Like that's a therapist, that's a counselor. Like that's the guy who's helping other people.
Right. And it will happen.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we're infallible. Is that a word?
Infallible.
Thank you.
Something.
Thank you. Infallible.
Yeah.
But that's sort of always weighing on you as well,
right.
Which is not different than, being in a relationship and how are you communicating with people, especially in a public situation, right?
Or even as a parent, right? Your kids are watching you, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're seeing this right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The best I ever hear is, oh, your dad must be so great. He's a therapist. And my kids are like
They're rolling their eyes.
What?
Like, yeah.
No.
He's not a therapist at home.
He's not. He's like, we totally have some tilts. Right? Like yeah, for sure. I've gotten into it with my kids and ex-partners and friends, and it's a lesson in learning,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't feel like it at the time. I mean, I know that sometimes when that happens for me, it's just like, oh my God, I did it again, blah, blah, blah. And you realize you're all this negative self-talk towards
The
yourself.
thing you talk about your clients.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you realize you're doing it. And I think what can happen is that the more we sort of realize, even not just therapists, but humans in general,
Mm-hmm.
the more we realize, oh, I'm doing that thing, you catch it sooner. And
Right.
there's this this whole understand, like
Holy, sacred,
sacred understanding.
beautiful.
Well, that's not a bad thing.
That's not a bad thing, right?
There's
Well,
sort
it's
of
like a higher self almost.
Right.
Like you're saying, wait, that's not me. This behavior, this
Right.
action was an action, and I can repair from that,
Right.
and that doesn't need to be how I define myself.
yeah,
right?
and you don't always like catch on that right away. Sometimes people
It's
have
like
to.
next week,
You
you're like,
have
oh,
people
remember
have
that
to,
thing?
guide you, and it's like, so, are
Remember
you
what you
aware
said?
of how you reacted? Oh yeah, for sure, I did it the right way, and then it's like, and is there a right way? I don't really know if there's a right way. I mean, I think
There are
there's
kinder ways.
there's an understanding or sort of there's certainly an energy or a feeling or that I'm bringing forward the best that I can.
Right.
In that
Versus I'm
communication.
lost in my
Right.
chaos.
But the one thing I wanted about communication, can I
Mm.
finish?
Yeah. Finish your thought.
Is that I think as people, as therapists, as human beings, as we sort of learn to be vulnerable and authentic and talk about this stuff, we start to realize that a lot of the communication, like we think we have issues with people, we start to realize that those are our issues, our reflections, our mirrors.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can get in those moments of like, hey, this isn't really about you, but I need to share this with you because this is coming up for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm
It's a
wondering
very
if
different
you can
tone,
help
right?
me with it.
Yeah, totally different. Rather than you did this thing, and
Right.
why are you doing this thing?
It's like,
Stop it!
Stop doing that. It's like, okay. And it'd be great if that always happened, but it has been my experience that it always happens, but you can feel that flow for people and for yourself when you start realizing that a lot of that communication has to do with my inner stuff that I either haven't dealt with
Mm-hmm.
or that I thought I dealt with and is now still coming to me.
Right. It's the next layer.
Yeah. As Texas would say, peeling that onion, and it has a lot of layers, Lucas. Thank you, Texas.
Thank you, Texas.
Appreciate that one. Yeah.
Thank you for
You're
your
welcome.
time
Yeah.
and for being with us on Therapist Thursdays. And we'll do it again.
My pleasure. All right. We'll see you
Okay.
again.
Bye.
Bye.